just want to thank David for being here. And before we get started, I should introduce myself. I'm Trin Wei. I'm Research Director for the Hinrich Foundation. And it's an opportune time, I suppose, to talk a little bit about what the foundation is. We are a philanthropy. We are dedicated to the mission of advancing global trade, which is a part of your world as well. And we're very glad to have you here because we are, among other things, the thought leadership content that we put out the strategic partnerships, kicking off a series of book talks. So it seemed like an opportune time when Robin Hu came along and sort of said that, well, David's written a book called Can Europe Survive? And we thought that, great idea. Let's have David come by, and perhaps an even better idea to invite a bunch of ambassadors from Europe and Canada as well as Turkey. And Philippe from the EU is here. Ambassador Beata from the Asia Europe Foundation is here, so that they can do the bulk of the hard questioning and I don't have to do any work. So what I wanted to say, though, David, was that what you have written, it's your 7th book. David, by the way, as all of you might know, is chairman and CEO of Open Markets and Financial Institutions Forum.
It's actually something like that, but it's called Official Monetary and Financial.
I apologize.
Apologize, it's a bit of a mouthful.
Right, OMFIF. And had a storied career in finance, and strange overlap with me was a journalist. Reuters, Financial Times. I was in the Wall Street Journal. But I'm completely unlike you because I've written 0 books, and this is your 7th. He's written mostly about Germany and Europe. A lot about politics, a lot about security, which is something I want to ask you about, as we go. This latest book that David has written, Can Europe Survive? I want to say is a tapestry. I mean, it is a history of security, of politics, the relationship between Germany and France, about EMU, about the future for all of us. And the level of detail in it is so striking that there was about a third of the way into the book, he's describing from the notes of a German diplomat who's taking notes during a meeting between Gerhard Schröder and Putin about the way Putin's cheek was trembling. And this is in the year 2000. So that's the level of detail that you would find in David's book. 8 chapters, it's about 300-something pages, but very readable. I'm going to let David do most of the introduction, but I want to preface it with a question, which is, why did you choose this subject, and how did you get started?
Yeah, well, thanks, Chen Wei. I'm sorry to be a bit late. It's been a bit of a scramble today. I just arrived this morning, but it's been a whole series of meetings. But I'm really pleased to be here and to see the Hinrich Foundation in real life. Well, I wanted to do a bit of an update on some of the earlier books I'd done about the European single currency, but so much of this is about politics. And so the people at Yale University Press very sensibly said, well, why don't you spread your wings a little bit and try to bring in all those elements that you've only just hinted at in other previous works, and bring in, as you say, the security and the political, the military, strategic angles to it as well. And so I wrote a synopsis at the autumn of 2022. This was after the full-scale invasion, of course, by Putin's Russia of Ukraine. So I think already the writing was somewhat on the wall when it came to what the ingredients would be. I had the feeling then that Europe was in a very vulnerable state vis-a-vis, above all, the United States. Of course, I didn't know then there'd be a second coming of Mr. Putin. But I simply figured out that in all the spheres of what I call the real building blocks of political economy, clearly in the energy and the industrial side, but also in the monetary and, of course, the military side, those 4 elements, for various reasons, the Americans were in the ascendancy and Europe was on the defensive. And my view was that Europe was caught in a a spiral of vulnerability. If you then add onto that the Chinese and the Americans anyway caught in a trade war, which was already incipient and clearly has got worse, it seemed to me that Europe was going to draw the short straw from all those different diverse events. And with Mr. Trump coming in, as he did, it didn't really change the overall narrative. Obviously, made the whole thing somewhat worse, and I had to bring in quite a bit about the character of Trump. What was most striking for me as the writer is that I wrote so much about Putin, simply because I kept going around talking to people, and they kept telling me stories. And I think you've indicated this, that clearly I'm not a historian, but I do think if you can try to make history alive by telling stories about it, it's a totally unoriginal idea. It clearly makes it more interesting because you somehow think you're there at the time, don't you? And also, if I can get people to say things that they haven't said before and we don't know about before, but nonetheless we think are true, clearly just because it's not been said before doesn't mean it's true. But if you can give it some element of authenticity and also try to tell the story from several different angles as well. I was very intent to talk to people from Asia, to try to get an Asian angle. I may not have succeeded totally, but I didn't want this to be just a totally Eurocentric story. And that's how the book did balloon. The Yale University Press, they said, for goodness sake, don't write more than 100,000 words. But it ended up at 190,000 words with all the notes as well. And I'm very pleased to say they didn't push back against that. I think if publishers ask you to reduce the size of a book, you should normally say, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that. I'm going to keep it as it is. But they didn't make that attempt. Yeah, but I mean, I don't think it's very easy to cut either. That's the other thing.
Well,
it's quite compact.
I would disagree. I mean, a book is never finished until you snatch it out of the author's hands.
Well, I'd like to think it's like one of those dry stone walls which are built, without seeing where the obvious cement is. It's very difficult to take one of those stones out of the wall without the whole thing collapsing. So, but I would say that anyway, wouldn't I?
But do you want to talk a little bit about? I assume that a lot of people here might not actually have read the book. It was published on November 11. Do you want to tell them a little bit about what it's got? 8 chapters. It begins with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Thousands of East Germans are streaming into West Germany.
Well, I did take the fall of the Berlin Wall as a vantage point and a pivotal moment. Clearly, that's not, again, an original thing to say. But because I was there, I was lucky enough to be the FT correspondent in Germany while all this was going on. In fact, I was sent to Germany, having been in Paris, because 2 of my very esteemed predecessors decided that Bonn was such a boring place, they didn't want to stay there. That was in 1986. And just as I arrived, things did start to happen. And I had been working already in Bonn in the 1970s, working for Reuters. So I already knew a little bit what was going on. And as soon as I arrived in autumn 1986, the Gorbachev stone did start to move. The fall of the wall, which nobody had predicted, and I made it my business to go around asking people, actually, as a journalist, when do you think the wall might come down? When do you think Germany will be unified? And I rather annoyed lots of people by asking them that. And of course, everybody thought it would happen a long time in the future, including Chancellor Kohl. He told me he didn't think he would live to see it, although he corrected his statement later to indicate he didn't think he'd live to see it as an active politician. But of course he did. My theory is that without the whole thing being totally unprepared, it wouldn't have happened, because if there had been a blueprint, then it would have been washed away by a whole sea of suspicion and rivalry and animosity. But the point is, once you take that fall of the wall as the seminal moment, a lot of things do flow out of that. I mean, some of you in the audience may disagree on this, but I don't think monetary union would have taken place at that time, last century, had the wall not fallen, had Germany not been unified. Also, without monetary union and without the problems that caused between the creditor and the debtor states, and the need to shore up the edifice of monetary union by setting up more mechanisms for taxpayers' money to be put on the line, I don't think Britain would have left the EU. And without Britain, if Britain had stayed in the EU, which I think would have been a better state of affairs, Europe would not have been so weakened. I think Britain has been weakened by leaving, and the EU has been weakened. Europe as a whole has lost out, I believe. And Europe now becomes a less stable place as a result of that happening. I'm not trying to say that we should have held up the fall of the Berlin Wall and the unification of Germany. I'm not doing a Thatcher on this. Clearly, it was something that had to happen at one stage. But if you think about it, there were three things which happened within the space of 2 years: the wall falling, German unification, and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Many people thought that just each of those elements by themselves, even after the preceding case, were not going to take place for a long time. Kohl thought after the wall fell, it would take 5 years for Germany to be unified. But such was the pace of exodus of the East Germans, it took place very, very quickly. And then the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was really a ploy by Yeltsin to get rid of Gorbachev. And that's the way it seems now, in the light of history. Again, all those things were tremendously destabilizing moments. So in a way, it's not surprising that all these three elements for which nobody was really prepared, it's not surprising that this has caused a kind of catharsis, which I think is still going on.
So the book actually moves from that through, the first half of it is really about the reunification of Germany, that is pivotal, and then the rise of Russia, and then it pivots to economic and monetary union, and then it talks about the relationship that Europe has, poised between China and the US, and then talks about the ECB, and it closes by posing a string of questions. One of which is that I think you made the observation that there has been no union that has really survived without going from economic, monetary to fiscal to political. But you end on quite an upbeat note. But how do you really?
Well, it is true, and I think you can have monetary union, say, between Switzerland and Liechtenstein, or issues if the Belgian or Luxembourg ambassadors are here, between two relatively small states like Luxembourg and Belgium. You can have an economic and monetary union between two relatively small states. It's difficult to do that with a number of polities which remain at least semi-independent. And one of the stories I relate, and okay, all these stories, obviously they're put in to try to make a wider point, but Eddie George, who was the governor of the Bank of England in the late 1990s, when Britain was still making up its mind whether it might become part of the first wave. This was under Tony Blair, who did want to be a good European. So he asked his people at the Bank of England, could you kindly, in a few days or a week or so, please write down a list of all the monetary unions that have taken place in the last 300 years and tell me, the governor of the Bank of England, what happened? Because I really would like to know. I'm the governor of the Bank of England. I need to help to make some decisions about all this. And the economists usually trotted off and did their homework and did discover that 30 or so monetary unions since, say, the Union of Scotland and England in 1707, most of them collapsed unless there had been a degree of political union. None of that told us anything we didn't know already, because Chancellor Cole had already said that on a number of occasions. But Eddie George was so shocked by this, because for him it was something novel. He said, well, go away, just lock that paper in a safe, because it will leak out, and people will either think it shows that I, the governor of the Bank of England, want a political union to come about in Europe as a means for allowing Britain to join, or it will be used as ammunition by people who are opposed to monetary union by saying it will never happen or it will never take place successfully because the governor of the Bank of England has released this documentation. So in a typical British thing, it was released as a non-paper of the Bank of England. It does exist on the website, but you can't actually read what the paper says because it says non-paper, non-published by the Bank of England. But there's a reference to it. And it would be quite good, I think, if the paper, written by a man called Judjit Chadha, who happens to be a friend of mine, who was the head of the National Institute for Economic and Social Research. He's a bona fide economist, but he'd love to have the paper published because it would be like a high point in his career. But I just mentioned that just to illustrate your point, which is well known, that monetary unions don't tend to survive unless they're linked by political and fiscal union. Now, I think European Economic and Monetary Union will survive, albeit in a not particularly ambitious or not particularly prosperous form. I don't see it collapsing, but I don't see it prospering. And all the time Europe is having to come up with all kinds of additional protocols and subterfuges and all kinds of acronyms for complex bailout mechanisms to make up for the fact that there isn't this fiscal and political union. I don't think it's feasible to have a fiscal and political union amongst these disparate states, particularly if some of them are really quite a mess. So this is old equation of Jean Monnet, does a mess help to produce unity? Is unity going to be forged in crisis? I don't think it will. I think you'll have a crisis too far. Others in the audience may disagree, but I do think that a crisis too far could really test Europe to its limits. Therefore, it's probably best to muddle through with a fair degree of subterfuge and obfuscation, and allowing the ECB to do things which maybe, according to the strict reading of its charter, it shouldn't be doing, rather than to have a complete upset and a complete catharsis.
Right. The title of your book is Can Europe Survive? I was having a conversation with Mo Heinrich, who's our founder and chairman. He's over there. And the question came up. When you ask that question, there are two questions from it. Which Europe and survive what?
Very good point you're making there, Ju-Wei, because what happened with me is a friend of mine who's got a very intelligent 5-year-old boy. And I gave this friend a copy of this book, and he said, this rather precocious young man, he posed exactly that question, 5 years old. And he said, what's this book about? And he said, what is it supposed to be surviving, Father? And the chap asked me. So 2 points, really. One is, where does Europe start and end? I think that Europe is an entity, a geographical entity, which goes beyond the European Union. So that's how I would define it. Clearly, it's a rhetorical question for which blame President Macron, because that was his words, wasn't it? L'Europe, c'est mortel. He said that in his second Sorbonne speech. Mr. Macron, who said Europe is mortal and it can die. He said that in his Sorbonne speech slightly more than a year ago. So it is clearly a rhetorical question. Survive what, and survive for what reason, and survive to what end? Clearly Europe will not be obliterated from the land mass, and so Europe will continue to survive. I mean, I suppose you could read this. I had not thought about this. Could Europe, as a greater mass beyond the EU, have a greater survivability factor than the EU? I haven't really thought about developing it in that line, but if somebody were to ask me that question, I'd say yes, I think it probably can, because there's a number of countries which are not part of the European Union, which are actually relatively stable countries, one of which is Switzerland, one of which is Norway. Britain is still relatively stable. I think Britain is in a less bad state than France and Germany at the moment, partly because there is still a government with a sizable majority. Keir Starmer may not be cutting exactly the best figure at the moment. He's made lots of mistakes, but he does have 144-seat majority, which should take him through for another 4 years. So I'm not really answering either of your questions, but the point is, it is supposed to be an open-ended rhetorical question, and it's supposed to make people think in exactly the same lines as the 5-year-old boy and yourself have both thought.
Yeah, both about the same age, intellectually. We have Leif Charmant here, by the way. He's ambassador of Norway to Singapore.
Yes, that's right. Well, you'll tell us all about Norway.
And I know there's probably a lot of questions already sort of brewing in the audience, but I'm going to be greedy and just have a couple more. I wanted to ask, because this is Asia that you're in, and in the book you compare the opinions of 3 people. Subrahmanyam Jaishankar, am I saying it right? Who talks about the current state of affairs as a reversion to a norm of sorts, a natural order, he calls it. And Kishore, whom I believe you met this afternoon, who says that the EU is just a mess. And Ravi Menon, whom we also know and has been here for lunch, and Ravi says to you. Europe's failing is not in engaging the global south enough. When you compare the three of them, who do you think, who do you gravitate to?
Well, I think those three actually demonstrate a very powerful synthesis. I was quite surprised by Ravi Menon, who's actually a very cautious, methodical, traditional central banker.
I was surprised he said it.
Yes, and he not only said that, but he also said something which is also quite heretical, but I think may well be true. He said he feels it was a mistake. Don't forget, all these quotes are all totally authenticated, all signed off. He said it was a mistake, he thinks, for Europe to put so much element into economic and monetary union, and should have put more effort into a kind of capital markets union, or should we say capital market framework. I rather like the word framework because it means you don't have to have everybody inside a union. But I was very surprised that he made this rather heretical remark that you could possibly think of a capital markets union linking the major European countries without necessarily having to have a single money. It's obvious these days that that is the case when everything is done through technology and you can use an app to translate currencies between each other. You don't need to have a single currency. But I think the other two gentlemen that you mentioned are perfectly at ease with what Ravi Menon said. To synthesize all those thoughts, I think it shows that Europe has been pretty unaware of the outside world. It's been too concentrated on itself, which is strange, really, when you consider how many really globalized economies there are in Europe, particularly, say, the Netherlands. Germany is very globalized, Britain as well. France has got a lot of national and international champions, but together, because of the huge effort that has to be made to bring together this rather disparate group of historically very proud, rich, ancient, traditional nations, the sheer effort of binding them together has meant that they therefore lose sight of the rest of the world. That's the way it seems to me. I know there's all sorts of European external action services and all sorts of efforts to engage with the rest of the world abroad through trade missions and things like that. But it does seem to me that Europe has turned inwards, and therefore I think the word might be complacency or even arrogance. This would be clearly very much a Kishore Mahbubani thought. But Kishore has clearly rubbed a lot of people up the wrong way. He's ruffled a lot of feathers over the years by being possibly Singapore's most undiplomatic diplomat. But I think he's right in lots of fields, that Europe has been rather short-sighted and has not been seeing the way that the rest of the world has changed. I mean, that sounds a bit kind of general criticism, and I don't want this to be unduly rebuking, because clearly there's lots of people in lots of countries in Europe who have dedicated their whole life to understanding the rest of the world. But if you take the whole body, it seems to me that it's been admired in a certain complacency and too much of an inward-looking spirit, simply because of the effort to bind together these disparate crew of nations, which are probably going to get more disparate as time goes on, and are not becoming more likely to be unified by the effect of, quotes, crisis, end quotes.
Yeah. Last week, the EU and the CPTPP signed a high-level. Debbie, is Debbie here? A statement of partnership. At the same time, the EU faces formidable problems and an opportunity in China. I mean, it has to reshape this relationship. I think it's conscious of it. It faces a number of issues with China in terms of unfair trade practices. I mean, that's always been a bugbear. The kind of exports that China now produces, and who was it who in your book, Rolik, Hans, the German Chancellery director, what's
Not Riller, was it? You were talking about
Hinrich
Riller.
Lars Hendrik.
Yes, the
Riller,
economic advisor to
right,
Merkel for much of her period.
Who talks about Europe forging an independent relationship with China that's quite unlike the US, and in recognition of its need to take Russia into consideration in that relationship. And last week you had the EU CPTP formalization. How do you see that relationship, the EU-China trade and economic relations?
Well, I see no reason at all why Europe as a whole, and there I would bring in countries like Britain too, cannot forge a relationship with China that takes account of realities, takes account of China's support for Russia in the war, tries to ring fence militarily relevant goods, but nonetheless maintains some common trade in goods that you can say are unlikely to be used in a kind of dual-use fashion. I see no reason at all why we can't bring some boundaries in here, a little bit like the old COCOM trading rules that we had during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. That should be done at a unified level, if possible. Again, that would go against the European Commission's view that this is the only body that can be the entity negotiating trade rules on behalf of the EU. You know, how would a country like Britain or Switzerland or Norway be part of that? From particularly the British and Swiss point of view, an independent position. But I would have thought with a certain amount of diplomatic subterfuge, one could come to a few common denominators here. In other words, one doesn't have to be totally friendly with China or totally doing things which are likely to antagonize the United States. One can use some imagination here, I think. Clearly, there's this huge problem of not wanting to antagonize Donald Trump. And there's a big damage limitation game going on just to try to prevent any ugly scenes in the Oval Office. I mean, this clearly makes life very, very taxing and difficult for heads of government and so on. But if Europe can forge a spirit of togetherness in dealing with China, and also if Europe can, from its own efforts, somehow rekindle dynamism independently of all that, then that would give Europe some greater negotiating cards. The position we have to try to avoid is being thought of as a supplicant by both superpowers, and to be thought of as a pitiable creature that needs to be pandered to and fobbed off from time to time. And I'm afraid to say Europe in its present very undynamic state, with Germany stagnating, some of the other peripheral countries doing a bit better, but Europe as a whole is not in a good place. It's a truism just to say this, but without rekindling growth, then Britain is always going to be on the back foot in dealing with China or indeed with the other superpower.
Yeah, that's actually at the heart of the question they are posing by the title of your book, isn't it? It's that's the state in which it seems to me that you fear Europe becoming. And
at some stage it will become too late. I don't think we're there yet, but at some stage the American technology companies will become so dominant and so well entrenched that we will be in a point of no return. I don't think that is happening, and one of the more salutary things that's happened recently is France and Germany deciding to try to pool forces in terms of offsetting some of this super dominance of the American companies in, say, cloud technology. I know that in the area that I deal with a lot, central banks, something that the whole Euro system is trying to do to lower this dependence on American cloud technology. It's a bit late to be doing that, because the Bundesbank, for instance, has worked out that companies like SAP or Deutsche Telekom have a market share of 2% or 3%, respectively, in terms of cloud technology used by the financial market players, whereas people like Oracle, other American companies, Microsoft, have market shares in the double digits. So from a difficult starting point, Europe is trying to push back against that, and the European system of central banks is one of the players in all that. Of course, one has to there look out for retaliation from Donald Trump once he realizes this is going on. He probably hasn't realized it yet. He may not read the Wall Street Journal every day, but once he does, then one could say a tide of opprobrium will come down on any unfortunate European government leader who happens to be passing through Washington. So I'm afraid to say we have to deal with this element of rather juvenile theatricality on the part of the American president.
Yeah. All right. Well, I still have a bunch of questions, but I probably should open it up to anyone who wants to ask David a question based on anything that he has said. Anyone? Paul, please.
Hi, Paul Topol. Pleasure to meet you, sir. Thank you very much for coming to Singapore. Just play a devil's advocate a bit. If you look at Europe as a bit of a regional, economic trading bloc, if you will. I mean, look at it in terms of benchmarking with others. ASEAN, Mercosur. I guess the question is, whether Europe. But then the question is, well, what's the aspirational goal if you're going to be a regional economic trading bloc? I mean, for those perhaps who are living in ASEAN, we all may have views related to the ASEAN consensus and its moving forward towards degree of marketplace harmonization or so on. Mercosur, as you know, has been challenged in terms of its evolution. So can I say, David, whether you're being perhaps unduly harsh relative to the others in the world?
Yes, you could say that, and of course, the further you go away from Europe, the more optimistic people are about Europe, and the better it looks. The closer you are to the heartland, the more pessimistic or rather down in the dumps people tend to be. I mean, the point you made about Mercosur and, say, ASEAN is that, of course, the level of trade integration in both of those entities is far, far lower, isn't it, than in the case of Europe. So you could say that's one giant tick you might put against the European market. Although I have to say that since the birth of the single market in the 1990s and the birth of the single currency at the end of the 1990s, the share of internal trade in Europe hasn't noticeably increased. So one might make the point you don't need a single currency in order to have a single market. I mean, a point I would make, actually, although, as you probably remember, that was the case that was made for the single currency. You can't have a single market without a single currency. But as I said, in the days when you can translate currencies into other currencies at the drop of a pen or a stroke of the brush on a keyboard, that's not maybe the case. I think at the heart of your question is what you might call this issue of, quotes, European values, end quotes. And this is a major element in Europe's success. It happens also to be part of the bedrock of the European community in the 1950s. Also, the degree of competition that is maintained in the European Union, not allowing monopolies. That's also a residue, I think, of the Second World War. That is something which does not prevail in America, because that's why you do have these gigantic companies which are winner takes all mentality. And you could say Europe has done the right thing by maintaining some anti-monopolistic practices. If you take things like freedom of speech, the role of democracy, particularly if you look at what's happened in the Central and Eastern Europe and the Western regions, Spain and Portugal, they were dictatorships in the 1970s. If you look at things like relatively egalitarian healthcare and pension system, a very feather-bedded social security, you put all those on the positive side. I'm not saying that all that has to end, but I would say is that's going to have to be mitigated. I do believe it's time for Europe to come up with some priorities, and it won't be able to do everything at once. All these challenges, I call them the 6 Ds, the demographic challenge, the deglobalization challenge, decarbonization, the whole issue of digitalization, defense, and debt. Those 6 just happen to all beginning with the word D. Difficult to maintain all those things and the prized social values. So we are probably going to have to, and indeed are already, cutting down on those social values, which, as you say, do mark out Europe as something of a success story. What really pains me is that all this is being diagnosed. Angela Merkel, Helmut Kohl, they've all said it, that Europe is living beyond its means, and yet not very much has been done about it. Europe is a nice place to live. it's a nice place for people to come to. People aspire to the level of living standards and social protection that we have. I just don't think that's going to continue.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. Anyone else? Otherwise, I was going to make an observation that one of the questions that you've raised is on the issue of I'm trying to remember now, the relationship with China. Do you see any politician right now in Europe that is also thinking along these lines, bearing in mind the Russian issue, having to solve the Russia issue? But is there any politician right now who sees things the way you do, is pushing toward that direction?
What do you mean in terms of trying to come up with a more, should we say, even-handed, relatively independent approach, which brings together what I call the low common denominator
Correct.
of European interests?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know whether I'm the right person to ask, really. Nobody has really been broadcasting that, but you could say, why should they at a pretty difficult time for relations, not only between Europe and China, but also given, as you say, China's support for Russia in the war. If this war were to end fairly soon, which I think it probably will, be interesting to have other points of view in the audience. It clearly does leave Europe looking very sidelined and looking with all kinds of bruises, and it may open up more Putin aggression, although my view, for what it's worth, would be that it wouldn't. I think he would be satisfied with a certain number of gains. That position might then be more propitious for bringing about this kind of rebalancing with China. I think China is getting a huge amount out of this at the moment. It's got this big brother relationship with Russia, which it never had with the Soviet Union. It's become a vast creditor of Russia, which it could well use to its own advantage at some stage in the future. It's keeping Russia alive militarily and monetarily, probably. It's going to exact some retribution, some concessions at some stage. It's got lots of skin in the game, China here. And the question is, will it cash those benefits at some stage? Will it demand land, for example, a kind of debt for land swap? Could it do a Louisiana purchase with some tracts of Siberia? I mean, these may not be terribly realistic, but there must be things that keep Putin and his advisors awake at night. So in other words, once this war comes to an end, and it will come to an end at some stage, perhaps sooner rather than later, there will be a bit of a redistribution of the cards on the table. I think Putin was likely to become less aggressive rather than more aggressive, and this might be the opportunity for him to seek another path of appeasement from Germany in particular. I don't think Germany wants to be a militarily dominant nation again. I think that higher defense spending is all very well, but an aggressively higher level of defense spending is not going to survive the end of the war. So that's a roundabout way of saying that if all these cards are redistributed as a result of the ending of the war, China might be in a very good position to exact concessions from other countries, including from Russia. And that might be a time when you would need to launch a new Europe, pan-European, if you like, pan-European Chinese policy. So this, I'm just answering your question with loads of other questions.
No, it's interesting. Does anyone have any response? Beata, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I don't know yet your book, but certainly the title is very interesting. And my question is, you came here to Asia, to Singapore, to also to promote your book, as I understand. So I would like to ask you how Asia can help Europe to survive. Whether there are some common values, common interest in different areas? Thank you.
Well, Europe needs to be humble enough to learn from Asia. One of the elements would be this question about, in this narrow sphere of financial markets, whether you can make financial markets somehow interoperable among each other without necessarily having to go the full mileage of forging a single currency. So I apologize, this is a slightly specific issue, but I'm not saying this is the end of the story. But one of the elements I do put out in the book is that you could have a single European framework for monetary transactions and investments that does link the UK and the European Union area. It wouldn't be a union, it would be a framework for sterling and the euro to be used. Interoperability could be there in the bond and the investment markets in the same way as you might have between Singapore, Malaysia, or Singapore and Thailand and Indonesia in ASEAN. So that might be one small step where the Europeans could say we could learn from this pragmatism. Somebody who I should be seeing when I'm in Malaysia in a couple of days is Zeti, who of course was the governor of Bank Negara Malaysia. And we always used to have these discussions with her about 10 or 12 years ago, how ASEAN would never even think about a single currency, but would nonetheless be trying to forge as many elements of commonality amongst the capital markets as possible. And I'm not sure whether that's really succeeded, but that seems to be an area, an approach that Europe can learn from. The other way of learning from or using ASEAN would simply be to go there more often, to forge greater links on the technology side. This may well be happening anyway. You would know far more than I would about this, whether there are schools of learning, research centres, Technische Universitäten and so on, with their spores being sent out to places like Malaysia and Singapore. I know there's a very large German community in both these countries, and I presume that technical excellence and learning from each other and basically doing research together is an area where one could go forward. Trying to encourage students from these countries to come to Europe. Maybe they're more likely to go to Europe than they are to the United States because of what seems to be a slightly uncivilized approach to visas and things like that in America at the moment. That could be a giant factor. Also, if you look at India, if you include India in this list of countries, so there's all kinds of areas where I would hope that the diplomatic representations are doing their bit to forge all sorts of practical project work. Doing these things from a bottom-up approach rather than top-down is so important, and I think that's where diplomats and the much more hands-on approach to diplomacy that people seem to have these days, doing things on a project-by-project basis, on a research basis, on an industrial basis, that seems to be a way forward where also you could bring in civil society as a whole, not just the diplomats. The diplomats could be the catalyst for all this. So I definitely think your approach is the right one, and one needs to think about more rather than fewer projects one can do together.
I think we had a question back there.
Hello. Yeah. Hi, I'm Thomas Mottag. I'm Deputy Head of Mission of the German Embassy. So first of all, thank you very much for being here and sharing your thoughts with us. I have started reading your book, but unfortunately hadn't the time.
It's a bit long, I'm afraid. Yeah.
But just to perhaps to brief points, we indeed have a very strong cooperation in the scientific field. Actually, Germany has the only external university outside of Germany based here in Singapore, which is the Technical University of Munich. So we do cooperation there. And I would like to use the opportunity just to defend the Europeans. I had the pleasure to be head of the Office of the Minister for European Affairs over the past 5 years in Germany. And I would completely agree with you that we're very much inward-looking. But I do not think that we do it because we're arrogant. I think we do it because we're very self-centered, because we need to come to terms with our own problems, and that unfortunately takes a lot of time, a lot of energy and efforts. But I don't think that it's an expression of arrogance towards other parts of the world. And now I would like to come to my questions, because I mean I understand you want to sell the book, hence the slightly alarming title, "Can Europe Survive?" But I wanted to point at one fact, that currently we have the enlargement process in the European Union. There's still another 10 countries who want to join the European Union. I think in Iceland we have a new discussion of perhaps rethinking the decision they had taken a couple of years ago and perhaps become the 11th candidate again. So I think there is also this dynamics of other countries wanting to join the European Union. So it's interesting to talk about, to put it in, or to rephrase it, talking about the survival, we could also talk about the death of the European Union. So it's kind of interesting that we still have a number of 11 countries who potentially want to join the European Union. And I think your question is, in a certain sense, a binary question, is a yes or no question, is a black or white question. And my impression is that within the European Union, I think it's pretty clear that we will survive, but the European Union or Europe won't be the same in the future as it is now compared to the current situation. And I'm asking the question, especially with view to the situation, the domestic situation, many of the European member state countries, where you have parties, politicians who favor a nationalist, intergovernmental vision of Europe, whereas the integrationists are rather perhaps on do not have a very favorable time currently. So my question to you would be, not necessarily talking about the survival of Europe, but what kind of Europe do you see there in 10, 15 years' time?
Well, you put your finger on a whole series of issues there, I would say. In terms of the question mark, I'm not sure whether that really sells more books. It seemed, taking seriously the point that Macron was making, it seemed to me a relatively mature way of looking at this. Clearly, it's a rhetorical question. It's not meant to be a binary question. It's meant to be a thought-provoking question in the way that you have just taken all that up. In terms of the enlargement process, as I said earlier, it is quite clear that as you go away from the centerpiece of European Union, people are more optimistic about it. And the point I make in the book is that the whole edifice of the European Union has been very good for the catch-up states that have joined in different ways over the last 30 or 40 years. Is the countries at the core that have been held back. You could say that's a natural element of what takes place, because countries which are behind in terms of GDP per capita do tend to go through a catch-up phase. I don't think it's necessarily given, though, that the countries which are in the center and should be profiting from this integration are going to be stagnating in the way that Germany has been doing. I mean, just as a little digression here, I remember Merz in what wasn't just an electioneering speech. He said last year that it was unparalleled. And this is an industrial policy statement. It wasn't an electioneering statement. He said unparalleled in the post-war history that the 6 of these great pillars of the German economy, the construction industry, the chemical pharmaceutical industry, the electro-technical industry, engineering, cars, and one other, I can't remember the 6th one, were all in dire straits all at once, and that's for a whole series of different reasons, isn't it? When you do have a country at the heart of this edifice, Germany, for whatever reason, going through a bad phase, that clearly does have a knock-on effect on the European Union as a whole. Just to your point about whether one should be too harsh on the European Union, I think one of the problems that we have as a result of Germany going through that phase is that Germany becomes less forgiving and less flexible when it comes to other countries. And often Germany has been a banker, either in word or in deed, or sometimes both, for European projects. So I think the difficulty that we're going through with Germany does bring about a greater malaise for the whole body, even though it's compensated to a certain extent by some of the peripheral countries doing better. In terms of the enlargement process, it's no wonder really that a number of these countries do want to join. But as you know as well as I do, some of the larger countries, if they were to join, would cause a great deal of adjustment pain, not least Ukraine, clearly being by far the largest of the accession states. I think it's very helpful and useful and good that there are those lists of countries in the Western Balkans which are on the list, and they're having to do their acquis to try to bring their standards in line with the rest of the European Union. It's also a bulwark against Russian aggression as well. We do know that. Bulgaria joining the euro at the beginning of January is partly a geopolitical statement to try to prevent forces of instability taking hold in Bulgaria. Bulgaria has been through quite a difficult time, lots of depopulation, a lot of people leaving. And so you're using the euro as a kind of political instrument, actually, to help in an overall process of stabilization. The same would certainly go for many countries in the Western Balkans. I think it's good also that there seems to be a process under which they won't all join at once. There's a pioneering group. Some of the smaller countries might join ahead of some of the others. It's going to still take quite a lot of time and effort. And then your final question, what kind of European Union will it be? Now, I'm trying not to be typically British here, because of course the way the people like John Major put forward the idea of enlargement was always to try to weaken the process of deepening. That was always a British ploy, which was fairly obvious. And clearly, widening has offset deepening in some ways. You could easily argue that the original six, had they remained together, possibly with the exception of France, would have gone much further in the direction of integration than adding all these other countries, which did take place. So there is a dichotomy between widening and deepening. I think it's absolutely incontestable there'll have to be this pragmatic federalism, which people like Mario Draghi have been talking about. Takes us back to the variable geometry idea of Jacques Delors, whereby you don't have to wait for all the countries to move ahead at the same pace. You are going to allow individual ships in this convoy to get ahead of the game. So that, I think, would be extremely helpful. And if accession by one or two of the West Balkan states over the next 6 years or so was to help in that process, I'd be in favor of it. So I'm not denigrating that at all, but I'm also not playing down the difficulties, particularly of the larger countries like Georgia and Ukraine. Final word on monetary union. If a country like Poland or Denmark or Sweden were to join the monetary union, I think it would give a huge shot in the arm to this project. These are relatively solvent countries, but they're not going to join, I think, if they feel there's a danger of some internal disorder. So it takes us back to this classic Marxist quote, not Karl Marx, but Groucho Marx, who said, I wouldn't want to join a club that would have me as a member. Because the point is, if a country like Denmark were to join, it would actually add solvency tremendously to the European Union, but precisely because the Danes are quite happy with their halfway house they have at the moment. I don't see any reason why the Danes will step up the pressure to join. The Czech Republic, maybe. That's going to be an interesting one to watch out for. That's a fairly solvent country, which might think that it's better placed to join the euro. I don't see Poland joining. That would be a marvellous shot in the arm for the euro if Poland were to join. I don't think that's likely to happen. So I'd take that accession point that you're making for the EU, but also add monetary union to it. But I mean, none of your points can I disagree with.
Thank you, David. Very thought-provoking. Thank you for coming, for presenting these thoughts. Just quickly comment, as my German colleague on the inward-looking, and then a question. On the inward-looking, von der Leyen said Europe is facing a collision of crises, and probably most of these crises are not homemade, so they came from outside on Europe, and Europe has been dealing with that. The question is a matter of perspectives. Now, I'm the EU Trade Counselor here in Singapore, and I've been dealing with the outside my whole career at the EU. The question is how much the views outside are forged by London and by the British press, because that is my experience in communicating. And I remember this also during the Euro crisis. We had similar kinds of discussions. Is Europe falling apart because of the Euro crisis? But at the time, I have the impression that very much also what you now reported on your discussions here in Singapore is forged a bit by the British press. Why? Simply because of the language. And people outside Europe, they read London press. They don't read the Le Monde. They don't read German press. They don't read Italian press. And therefore, this is a very one-sided view which comes through it. You could argue that this was particularly pronounced during the pre-Brexit period, and this has been leveled out a little bit. It's becoming more neutral. But how do you see that?
Well, I think you've got to distinguish between different elements of the British press. Also, if you're talking about the language, then you would have to take into account the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. You'd have to take into account the American television networks as well, wouldn't you? If you're talking about the lingua franca of world communication being English, I don't think you can just single out the quotes British press, end quotes. Also, if you're talking about the whole debate about Brexit, clearly there was a huge amount of lies being peddled by the different members of the by the different members of the British press there, which were for domestic consumption. I don't think that had much effect abroad. I don't think there'd be many people in the chancelleries or in the corridors of power paying too much attention to the Daily Express or the Daily Mail, but it certainly had a big impact, or the Sun in the UK. So I think you've got to distinguish between channels which are catering for domestic opinion, which may well indeed lead to distortions and lies, and those which are more catering for external opinion. Now, this comes down to the Financial Times, because the Financial Times, I think everybody would agree, is by far the supreme chronicler in the English language of what's going on in Brussels. And I know from German friends that they do take this as sometimes somewhat demeaning for their own efforts. But on the other hand, I did used to work for the Financial Times until now, 30 years ago, so quite some time ago. But I do think that the FT is a remarkably internationalist, and I wouldn't want to say pro-European, but very European-orientated newspaper. I don't think that anybody who's sitting in Singapore and is reading the FT is going to get a distorted view. They obviously would if they were reading the Daily Mail, but they wouldn't be stupid enough to spend all their time reading the Daily Mail. So I often do hear this view. I've often thought also, interestingly enough, that there should be more vibrant international papers in the English language from Singapore and from Malaysia. Let's say you have things like the Straits Times, you have the Edge. And of course, when Nikkei took over the FT 10 years ago, you could say that was Asia striking back. But of course, the FT has not noticeably changed under the Nikkei ownership. It's become better, I think, because Nikkei has put a huge amount of money in on improving the technology, which the FT's owners wouldn't have been able to do before. So although I do accept that the press does distort things, I don't think myself that your premise is correct, that this has led to a distorting lens when it comes to, say, a reserve asset manager sitting in Paraguay who's wondering about whether or not he should buy euros. I don't think he's going to get from the FT or from the BBC or CNN an inaccurate picture compared with what, say, the FAZ or Le Monde might produce. Yes, I subscribe to the FAZ and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. No, not the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, as well as the FT. But I don't know about you, I don't have time to read all this stuff, I have to say. So sometimes, of course, you do almost in quasi-desperation just read one paper. So even though there are other channels available, I think I pay 22 euros a month to be a subscriber to the Frankfurt Allgemeine, but I've not really found out how to use the website. It's my own fault, you might say. So I'm a victim of this one-sidedness, you might say, clearly because there's not enough hours in the day. I don't know how you get around this. There's lots of very good Brussels news services, aren't there, in the English language that do provide services for people all over the world who want to know about what's going on in Brussels. So I think there's lots of diversity for those who want to spend the time looking at all this material. And I would certainly bring in the New York Times and say some of the other American outlets here. So I recognize what you're saying, but I don't totally agree.
Well, there's been a great deal of consolidation in the American journalism industry that probably closed down quite a few bureaus. Anybody else? I think we might have time.
You always get a forest of hands at the end.
Thank you very much for very interesting Q&A here. I'm the Swedish ambassador, and I was sitting here thinking about a lot of this, as colleagues have said, a lot of this has been a little bit of an external shock. What happened in Russia, of course, we have, and Ukraine, we have seen this coming for many, many years, but still now when we have faced this very, very challenging security situation, and at the same time we have other movements going on inside, in particular the European Union, but also in other European countries. But at the same time, Europe is also a symbol, and in words and deeds, for an international rules-based world order. We stand up for certain principles when it comes to international rules, when it comes to climate and many, many other things where we would like to see progress and we would like to see positive change. And of course, that position might even become stronger when we see a lot of external pressure and a lot of things are in flux. So it would be interesting to hear your comments on that. And if we talk about the Draghi report in particular, because that's a bit of a insightful report on how we could repair some of these things that are not going in the right direction. Do you see any beacons of hope here from the Draghi report, and where you see that we are heading in the right direction? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, earlier today we had a discussion about this at another event here, and there was a minor disagreement about how much of the Draghi report has been implemented. I think I've seen some figures saying that about 11% has actually been implemented in a meaningful way, but there's also a figure which says everything apart from 11% is in the planning stage. So you've got to distinguish between things which are maybe underfoot and underway, but a long way from reaching delivery. This issue about reforming the insolvency laws, which is now taking place, albeit at a fairly slow pace, but that's something that's been dogging the European Union and the attempts to forge a capital markets union for about 20 years. There's been this encouraging sign of the French and the Germans leading this effort regarding the cloud technologies, which is an area where the European system of central banks are playing a role as well. We've had some initiatives probably taking place already, but being speeded up on the rare earths idea. I do think this is a real area where finance and geology and politics can come together in terms of looking at countries in Africa, say, and making use of mineral resources there in a way that does prevent Europe from being squeezed by other sources of supply. So there has been a number of developments which are, I think, quite propitious in the last few months. So that has to be said. In terms of these overall values, Beacon in some way regarding what Europe is doing vis-a-vis the rest of the world, this has been the bedrock of European success, been one of the reasons why countries from Central and Eastern Europe have wanted to join, one of the reasons why Spain, Portugal, Greece are no longer dictatorships. So that all needs to be hung up there as a badge of honor. But it's the past, and we're now looking at the future. And I think there has been a danger to rest on one's laurels. In the case of Sweden, as you say, it was a shock. Sweden has been a neutral country. It can't have been part of Putin's war aims to bring in these two countries, Finland and Sweden, which when roused can be quite bellicose, as history has shown, and have got quite big military industrial complexes as well. Can't have been part of his war aims to bring the NATO border somewhat closer to his western flank in the way that he has done. And it seems to me that's been a major own goal for Putin, that Sweden is now part of this and can add your huge industrial expertise to what's going on already in terms of joint armaments and so on. So that shock, which you mentioned, has had a salutary effect, I would have thought, in terms of reaffirming a defensive alliance and bring in some extra resources. I still don't think that that's going to be enough if Putin does, instead of turning aggressive, he turns back to being a kinder, gentler Putin of the sort we saw in his initial years. If this peace deal is signed, if they come back into the G8, for example, which is one of the things that has been put onto the table, can Europe continue to sanction a country that's in the G8? I'm not saying they're going to be in the G8. Maybe that's not going to be part of the overall arithmetic. There's been a number of extraordinary things that Putin has made Mr. Trump put into this 28-point paper. If those are enacted, if the Europeans agree, we're going to be dealing with a different sort of relationship between NATO and Russia, of the sort different from what we have now. You'll remember when we had this NATO-Russian Cooperation Council in the 1990s. Surely that would be a good outcome, that we somehow stabilize Russia, and that Russia is going to have a new leader at some stage, does become stabilized back to the old idea of becoming a Western-orientated, technology-seeking, modernizing economy. I don't think we can rule that out totally. How can we? History hasn't stopped. One of the, if I may say that with the German colleague here, I think one of the not so realistic points made by Annalisa Baerbock, the former German foreign minister, was that Russia is going to be frozen out of trade and commerce with the rest of Europe for a very long period. I don't think it's going to take place. I think there will be a return of Putin, or a return of Russia under a new leader, back into the European fold. And if we bring about this under the right security conditions, how can we say that's a bad thing to take place? So possibly these shocks that we've seen under a certain number of slightly benign circumstances could be reversed, and it could be a better outcome. I'm groping in the book towards a slightly more optimistic outcome, and one of the things I do say is that there will be a change in Russia. It's a truism to say that, because Russia will not continue on this aggressive, bellicose, victimized, grief-ridden, retribution-seeking path that is on now. That's not going to be the pattern for the rest of recorded history. That's obviously the case. And if those circumstances do change, I think Nord Stream 2 will probably be opened again. I'm not going to hazard a guess when that's going to be. I don't think those bits of infrastructure are going to lie simply unused. They'll be repaired, I think, and be brought back into service. They may be pumping hydrogen, of course, rather than gas. We will see. So the future remains beguilingly open.
Any other questions? I'll just ask one, very last one. Does Putin think in those terms? Because it seems to me that he thinks in terms of sovereignty. And that is a large part of your narrative and your description of him and the interviews that you conducted about him. I mean, it's optimistic. And in your book, you talk a lot about, Strobe Talbot's quote about the greatest fire sale in history was the giveaways that Russia conceded to, or the USSR conceded to. And one of which is the NATO's right to move troops east of Elba. So do you really see that happy outcome that you just described?
Well, Putin or whoever else is in power is going to be mercantilist. One of the issues about Putin is that he made a real study of Catherine the Great. He studied metallurgy as one of his evening courses after he went into the academic field and started to improve his mind. Must have been just before he joined the KGB. So he's fascinated by the mineral wealth of Siberia and how to maximize that. He's a bit of a chameleon. One of the ambassadors who I spoke to, a retired ambassador, otherwise I'm sure he wouldn't have said it, man called Roderick Lyon, who was the chargé d'affaires, or the head of the political section in the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union collapsed, and then went back in the early 2000s to become the British ambassador. He said something which has really stuck in my mind about Putin, because Putin, as you all know, has never been a superstar. He was never a top-flight KGB operative. He was a bit of an inferior figure parked in Dresden. But Rod Lyon said about him, he said he was brought up in humble circumstances in the back street of Leningrad. He wasn't particularly tall, he wasn't particularly strong, he wasn't particularly bright. So he did what any young boy would do in those circumstances. He learnt judo and joined the KGB. And so that in a way sums up how Putin has always been pushing back against external circumstances. When he thought that the West was on his side fundamentally, he made a beeline, not just for Gerhard Schröder, but also for Tony Blair. Huge history of seduction between Blair and Putin. So those days could return. They're done for mercantilist reasons. The sovereignty issue, the NATO border getting closer, particularly in the case of Ukraine, I think that is a bridge too far. I don't think Ukraine will or should join NATO, even though you could say any nation does have a right to join NATO. We know that that's in the Charter. But I don't think that will happen. And I do think there was, not in the entirety of the American political establishment, but even people like Condoleezza Rice were prone to a certain triumphalism. And certainly people like Nick Brady, who was the Treasury Secretary under George H.W. Bush, he once said, we don't want the Russians to reform. If they do reform, they will once again develop a military-industrial complex. We want them to remain as they are, a third-rate state. I'm not saying that Nick Brady was talking for the whole of the American establishment, but there was a certain feeling that the Americans had won the Cold War, and there was going to be a big effort to put the Russians back into the box. Obama saying about 12 years ago that they were a regional power. That summed that all up. So he is a psychological trauma, Putin, and we need to take awareness of that. And I think if circumstances change and that he's given some type of feeling that his borders on his western flank are secure, and if he does feel that Ukraine is not going to become bulwark of NATO, I believe that he could be engaged in a peaceful process. China is going to have to play a role in all that. That's the one thing I would say, given the fact we've been speaking about China. Which way China will fall in that area, whether China will think it's got enough concessions out of Putin, can it extract a certain price for this? That I don't know, but I would like to think that China will play a role there, and I'd like to think it will be a positive one. I obviously don't know the answer to that question.
No, I would like to too. But it resonated with me that it occurred to me that, keeping Russia as a third-rate power might also have crossed China's mind. And that point you made about Tony Blair, Putin had said to him the fantastic detail from your book, I am a man you can do business with. Which was... Anyway.
I think it's clear that just as Mrs. Thatcher somehow discovered, end quotes, Gorbachev, there was a feeling Putin, Mr. Blair, he did go to St. Petersburg before he was officially inaugurated as president, precisely because he did think, for the good of his own country. Mr. Blair thought it was going to be for the good of Britain to forge a constructive relationship with this new man in the Kremlin.
Yeah.
You can't say that was entirely wrong either. And I think such days could return. Very interesting to look at Blair's memoirs, which were written in about 2009, so quite late. The immense fellow feeling he demonstrates for Putin at that time. And I think Blair wrote that book all himself. It's not ghost-written. Those are his genuine feelings.
Okay. Well, on that note, any final questions? Otherwise, we might break for drinks. And I just want to take this opportunity. Thank you so much, David, for taking the time to come by and talk to us about this.
Well, thanks for your interest. It's been marvelous, and it's very thought-provoking for me as well, because it certainly does mean that I go down a few tracks that I hadn't explored before. So it's very enriching for me as well. Thank you very much for organising that.
Thank you.